I'm back with Ze'ev Orenstein, Director of International Affairs at the City of David Foundation in Jerusalem. This is an organization doing very important work in not only in archaeology, but also in education. And Ze'ev, we were talking about these amazing discoveries of seals and coins. Now, the City of David sort of tourist office, if you will, was right up there, and people, I guess, would stop by to get information. But then an anthropologist named Elliot Mazar came up to you and told you, you got to move this office.
That's right.
Talk about that and talk about why and what she was getting at.
So 2005, Dr. Eilat Mazar, world-renowned archaeologist, she comes into our visitor center and she says to us, you need to move your offices. We ask her why. She says, beneath your feet, you will find the palace of King David. That's one of those moments. What do you say to that? So he said, Dr. Mazar, people have been digging in the City of David for the last nearly 150 years. No one's ever said that before. What makes you so certain this is the place? She says very simply, the City of David is a city on a hill. And if you're going to have a palace in a city on a hill, where will you find the palace? The top of the hill. She says, this is the top of the City of David. This is where you'll find the palace of King David. We said, Dr. Mazar, with all due respect, maybe 3,000 years ago, in the time of David, maybe people built their palaces at the bottom of the hill, maybe in the middle of the hill. We're not going to move our visitor center simply because for you to be queen today, you would build your palace right here. So what else do you have to support your theory? She shows us something found about 60 years before, a royal Phoenician capital that would have stood atop an ancient column or pillar. And she says, this proves that this is the location of King David's palace. So what's the connection? She said, well, if you know the Bible, you wouldn't ask questions like that. And we said, well, help us out. And she says, well, the first thing David does after conquering Jerusalem and making it his capital is he reaches out to his neighbors in the north, the Phoenicians. And in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11, it speaks of how the Phoenicians are the ones who come and build King David's palace, which is why we find Phoenician stonemasonry in the City of David. So she now begins to dig with the Israel Antiquities Authority, and they find at the base of the walls, massive, thick walls, 20 feet thick, thicker than the walls of the White House, pottery and other organic material, which she dates to the time of King David. Others date to shortly a period right after David, but there is near consensus this was the royal government center of the Davidic dynasty, the original Capitol Hill going back to the time of King David. In the same excavation, a few years later, Dr. Mazar finds two seals in Hebrew dating back 2,500 years ago, which bear the names of two of the four advisors who tell King Zedekiah, the last king of the Davidic dynasty, to kill the prophet Jeremiah. We find their seals in the palace, in an ash layer with antiquities dating back to the period of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. So you have the right people at the right place at the right time, all in an excavation that just a few years ago was still underground. Now, not that long ago, I hosted a delegation of European Union officials. And they said, well, what do the Palestinians think about all this stuff? And I said, well, their leadership, they hate the City of David. They said, well, why is that? I said, well, the story that the Palestinians have been telling for many, many decades now is that Jerusalem is a colonial project. You're occupiers and colonizers. You have no heritage here. You don't belong here. And I said, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is the City of David. Because every single day we are unearthing heritage that is showing not simply as a matter of faith, but a matter of fact that the Jewish and Christian heritage in Jerusalem is real. You could see it. You could touch it. It's what you might call an inconvenient truth. And I said to them, if you want to separate the archaeology from the politics, I have a simple, foolproof, guaranteed way to do that. They were very excited. What is it? I said, all that has to happen. You could still put out your peace plans and whatever you want. The heads of the European Union, the heads of the United Nations, the heads of the Palestinian leadership just have to acknowledge one thing, that the Jewish people, and by extension Christians, have been in Jerusalem for thousands of years. That the archaeology incontrovertibly shows that. This is not a big ask. Just recognize it and now call for whatever peace plans you want. And one of the heads of the European Union looks at me and says, they will never agree to that. I said, well, what do you want from us? We are uncovering the heritage. And again, it's our shared heritage. For Americans, this is your heritage too, that is actively at the United Nations, throughout Europe, college campuses, Palestinian leadership being actively denied and attempted to erase.
And let me come at this from a little different angle, which is that we're talking about events that occurred not just 2,000 years ago, which would be Christ, but when you go back to David, what are we talking about?
3,000 years ago.
3,000 years ago. Stuff that you would think would have been absolutely washed away by the by the sands of time. And for centuries, there was, I think I'm right in saying, no independent confirmation outside of the Bible that these people were real.
Absolutely.
It seemed, in fact, to many skeptics and even scholars that, look, this is sort of like, the kings of Troy, the Trojan War. Yeah, I mean, we don't expect to find, the bones of Achilles,
Right.
because Achilles was made up by Homer. The bard was passing on a legend, and the Bible was seen to be in that category. But what we're now seeing is that whether or not you accept the supernatural aspect of the Bible, the historicity of it. There was a King Hezekiah, there was a King David. He had a palace and he had successors and they lived right here. And these are their seals. I mean, this is like kind of bone-chilling stuff.
And the amazing part about it is, up until about a century ago, certainly in the West, it was taken for granted that the Bible was true. People believed. 100 years later, you could hardly find a university campus anywhere in the West where there isn't a whole department about biblical criticism, where believers are oftentimes mocked and scorned by the culture. And yet, at a time with unprecedented denial, we have unprecedented discovery taking place, showing that the biblical heritage of Jerusalem is not simply a matter of faith, but a matter of fact. And people now have the freedom to make a decision on their own. You have the skeptics, you have the denial, but you also have the discovery.
Amazing. Let's take a pause. We'll be right back.